In the United States, there have been angry scenes after a draft judgment written by that country's Supreme Court appears to show that the top court in the land is going to strike down the right to abortion for all women in all states. If the draft judgment becomes the final judgment, that would mean that individual states in the U.S. would be allowed to ban abortions, despite the fact women have had legal access to abortions across the entire country since 1973. It's a case that could overturn the decision in the case which granted the federal right to abortion, which is called Roe versus Wade. Brooks Spector is an expert on American politics and international relations. He's an associate editor at Daily Maverick. Brooks, good afternoon to you. We've had legal abortions in South Africa for over 20 years. In most of Europe, abortion's been legal for many, many years. In so many other countries, it's the same thing. Why in the United States is abortion such a big political issue when it's not such a big political issue in so many other places?
A couple of questions, things are intertwined together. First of all, the right to abortion or reproductive freedom was fought for in individual states because there was no national law on it. There's obviously no provision about it in the Constitution, which was, after all, drafted some 200 years ago. And the cases were argued. There were actually two of them ultimately in a row. They were argued through the courts, and the Supreme Court at the time, back in 1973, looked for and found in one of the early amendments the right to privacy, and from the right to privacy flowed the right to control over one's body, and from that the court then inferred different versions of when abortion would be acceptable, when it would only be acceptable to protect the life of the mother, and when it would not be acceptable. But in response to this, in response to Roe v. Wade, social and religious conservatives began to fight back, began a struggle in state legislatures to restrict it in a number of states that would have otherwise been open and freely available. And ultimately taking this case, the most recent one now, to the Supreme Court, where it is thought on the basis of this draft, this opinion, that the absolute right to abortion would be overthrown. That does not mean, however, that it would be prohibited in all states, simply because a number of states, many big ones like California, Illinois, and New York, and most of the rest of the northeastern states, have abortion protected by law, by state law, that is. And as a result, you're going to see a whole sea change in the way in which women seek out abortions if this goes the way it seems. Keep in mind, though, that this was an early draft opinion. It's apparently 2 years old, 2 months old, and it was prepared, as the Supreme Court always does, as a proposed opinion, a proposed judgment, and then it is subsequently debated and fought over between the various conflicting sides or the various members of the 9-member court. And it is not entirely clear that the final opinion will be set out in the way in which this original draft opinion, which apparently has been verified as true, it's not clear that this would be the wording of the final opinion. Regardless, though, this is going to be fought over between two different sides in the country, social and religious conservatives, and those who argue that my body, my right, in a sense, the slogan. And I don't see any easy way out of that for the next number of years.
What's so interesting, Brooks, is that from what I understand, surveys, and I mean surveys are not elections, but surveys in the United States show that there is certainly a majority of people, so of all of the population in the United States, nearly 60% of people believe that everyone should be able to get an abortion everywhere, in every state. And yet, despite that, Republicans use this, let me say it, very cynically, I think, to get votes from certain people. How does the maths on that work? How are you able, with a minority of people, to have so much power in certain states?
Well, in part because a decision by a state legislature or the Congress or the court or whatever isn't done on a referendum. And it's quite clear that a majority of people in the country support a woman's right to choose, just as a majority of the people in the country support gay marriage. And that's also something that's been fought over, and probably it may even come back to haunt people. But the difference is that people who support strongly restrictions or the abolition of abortion are what we would call single-issue voters. They are motivated extremely strongly on the basis of a particular question, in this case abortion, and they register to vote, they show up to vote, they lobby legislators, they make their case known, they contribute funds to interest groups that lobby, and the rest of us, in effect, have lots of issues on our mind and lots of things. And so you weigh various questions in terms of who are you going to vote for and how you're going to support them. But if you really, really believe strongly in issue X, you will work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to make sure that whoever's picked as your legislature, your congressman or woman, supports your views. And that's how you win, because turnout in the United States at state level elections is low. For midterm congressional elections, it's also low. And even for presidential elections, it's well below the average in many other countries.
So well, this gets to the next question. There are midterm elections for Congress this year. Congress, as I understand it, could, if it had a majority in that way, and through the Senate, legislate a federal right to abortion. I realize that's a very simple thing to say, a very difficult thing to actually do. But does this now mean that abortion is going to be the issue of the midterms in a way it wasn't going to be before?
Well, it certainly means it's going to be one of the most salient issues, because the way this came about with this surreptitious release of an initial draft opinion has now absolutely electrified all of the early primary votes, some of which took place yesterday, primary voting for congressmen and women in a number of states, and especially in some Senate races, the most important of which was probably Ohio. And you may remember the name J.D. Vance, the man who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, running as a very hard Trump-style Republican in Ohio. And now, obviously, his election will hang on this kind of thing. Abortion is going to be certainly the big social issue, probably only rivaled by the question of immigration and immigration control, and specifically immigration control at the southern border with Mexico. And between the two of them, they may well be poisons for Democratic candidates in many races across the country, which means that it is entirely possible the Democrats will lose control of the House and the Senate, which will make Joe Biden's last 2 years in term number one, assuming he runs again, it's going to make it very, very difficult to achieve any sort of major legislative initiative. It's almost impossible to foresee a push in Congress to pass a law which sets out the rights for abortion for women throughout the country, although certainly it's legally possible and it would be upheld in courts, because that is, after all, one of the functions of the Congress, to legislate.
Brooks, very quickly, if you can, all of this surely puts into question the legitimacy of the Supreme Court of the Supreme Court in the U.S. We know how important the legitimacy of our constitutional court is. No matter what happens, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the U.S. is going to be badly affected.
Oh, it is. I mean, the court was already tottering a bit because of the way in which certainly the last justice was very quickly appointed and confirmed, and the previous one, the very acrimonious hearing about his personal and private life as a teenager. But what this does is it says that the communication and discussion among judges while they consider a case, while they consider an issue, is now kind of a public free-for-all as well. And that really hurts the ability of people to see the court as above the daily fray, because now it's quite clear it's part of it.
Brooks Spector, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time.